Our new topic is contemporary Asian American immigration. And by contemporary, I really mean 1965 through 2021. And as you can see in the slide before you, 1965, the Immigration Act. That law is going to be so crucial. It's going to lead to this reconfiguration of uh, what Asian America is all about. Certainly, in terms of population number, we're going to see a precipitous rise in Asian American population number to the point where today, in 2021, Asian Americans constitute about 6% of the American population, whereas before it was around 1%, if not less. But not only population numbers, but you know, um, things like gender, social class, um, educational level of immigrants, so on and so forth. Family formation certainly is going to change drastically. So, all these things we'll discuss. Now, when you put this together with these historical forces like globalization and transnationalism, these historical processes, it's again going to affect in tandem, right? These processes in tandem are going to affect the landscape of Asian America. So that's why they deserve to be put together when we discuss contemporary Asian American immigration. But first, let's talk about the 1965 Immigration Act. But let me first say this, though, that as a result of these processes together, we're going to see between 1968 and the current times, the current contemporary moment, we're going to see 14 million Asian-born immigrants coming to the United States. Okay, in those decades, and as I described it earlier, this is just an astronomical increase when you compare it before 1965. So I just mentioned this, right? It leads to a drastic reconfiguration of the Asian American landscape. And we could see here some contrast. Before 1965, as we know, most of the Asians coming over were basically unskilled, cheap labor, right? Cheap labor force. And let's think, for example, of the Chinese working in the mining industry, in the railroad, the Japanese working in agribusiness in the West, certainly the Filipino migrant workers during the Great Depression working in the fields. Um, let's also remember, in terms of, I'll skip here to gender ratio. Most of them were men coming over because that was really what was demanded of this, at least in the eyes of the recruiters, right? American recruiters felt that they should recruit young men. And this is going to affect family formation, obviously, because without the presence of women, you don't see a formidable ethnic community that arises that is comparable to, say, other industrial cities in the United States like Chicago, New York, Boston, where they have these ethnic neighborhoods coming from Europe, right? Immigrant communities forming from Europe or immigrants from Europe, like Polish and Italian and so forth. You don't really see that in the case of Asian America. Why? Because family formation is largely prevented. We talked about immigration laws like the Page Act. We talked about anti miscegenation laws, um, and so on and so forth. Even just citizenship laws that barred Asian Americans from citizenship. Basically, that's going to stunt the formation of family, as you can readily see. So you don't see this again critical mass of family formation and community formation compared to other ethnic groups. All right, and as a result of that being barred altogether from immigration, like the 1882 Exclusion Act, you see much smaller populations. Um, let's recall the Asian Exclusion Act, the Asiatic Barred Zone, all those things. Smaller Asian population, and within the groups itself, the ethnic and nationality groups of Asians, Before 1965, you see it's mostly comprised of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos. You had some Koreans, you had some Indians, but very small numbers. But after 65, you're going to see the number of Asian ethnic groups widen. We already talked about the Indo-Chinese, which includes, four ethnic groups. So immediately we see that. Plus, you see other South Asian groups, not only Indians, but Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so forth. And then, of course, more recently, you see persons from Thailand and other countries coming over. Okay, so after 1965 immigration, you also see more educated, in other words, less unskilled labor. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no longer unskilled labor post 1965. Of course, there is, and we'll discuss that. But before, you didn't really see the educated and professional classes coming over from Asia to the United States. And this is what we'll see after 1965. Certainly, you see now a more balanced gender or sex ratio, right, between men and women. And because of that, you see family formation now enabled. And as I just mentioned, newer immigration groups um, from different nationalities or different ethnicities. Okay. So, as I just mentioned a few moments ago, between 1968 and the year 2020, you see over 14 million Asian immigrants coming to the United States. Okay, so you can see how this is a drastic reconfiguration. Okay, so now since we're squarely focusing on the 1965 Immigration Act, we have to ask, what is this law and why was it passed? Okay, first of all, we have to notice the year 1965. And this is contemporaneous with the civil rights movement, as I just alluded to earlier, right? This is the pinnacle of the civil rights era, the mid 1960s. And this pinnacle coincides also with the height of what you could call American liberal politics, right? Cold War liberal politics, which was best emblematized by people like JFK, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson, the Great Society programs that basically are involved not only with civil rights, but with trying to make American society improve in terms of its welfare of its citizens, education, attainment, housing for citizens, and so on and so forth. What we could call, public goods, right? What was defined as public goods during this high tide of liberalism were things like I just mentioned, right? And they try to make them readily available and accessible to as many Americans as possible. And by the way, this was thought feasible because during the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, this is the high point of American economic prosperity. Okay, the 50s and 60s was in our economic history since the beginning the highest point of economic affluence and prosperity. And I alluded to this earlier with the discussion of immigrants from Indochina. This would take a downturn by the 1970s. But again, during the 1960s, it was felt we could afford this, in other words, all these programs that were meant to improve society. Okay, so that's the context here in the domestic sense. Now, let's recall the 1924 Immigration Act that I talked about in our topic of the law in Asian America. Well, the 1924 Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, was passed during the high point of nativism, that is, anti-immigration. The two sponsors, Johnson and Reed, wanted, first of all, they were anxious about the fact that the Anglo-Saxon race, so to say, was being overcome by, Mediterranean Europeans, Eastern Europeans, Asians, so forth. So they passed laws that placed quotas on on the number of immigrants that come over, and it's based on national origins. Okay, to use our quote, or excuse me, our term earlier. That is, if your nation happened to be whiter in skin, then you had a high ceiling, high quota in terms of who could come over. If you were a country from, let's say, Africa, much lower. Okay, in fact, as low as, let's say, 100 a year. So it's self-evidently race-based, self-consciously race-based. All right. So, and by the way, Asians with the Asian Exclusion Act or Oriental Exclusion Act, right? Asians barred altogether. All right. Now, let's think about the civil rights movement again. With this groundswell in American society, whereby these racial minorities, racially marginalized groups, rising in protest of their secondary positions in society, right? Well, obviously, um, racial politics is even reflected in our immigration laws, right? Like the 1924 Act. So, in other words, at the same time that the civil rights era wanted to dismantle Jim Crow in the South, that is to say, legal segregation, right? You may have heard of that. Where segregation was sanctioned by the law in the South, the American South, right? You even had a Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, passed in 1896, that basically sanctioned this. All right. Well, if you know anything about civil rights, the Plessy versus Ferguson would be repealed or overturned by 1954 with the Brown versus the Board of Education. And then we have the passage after things like, Martin Luther King and his speech in Washington in 1963. By 1964, you have the Civil Rights Act, and then 1965 Voters' Rights Act, which restored the voting for African Americans. All this stuff is civil rights, right? Now, with 65, you can see how the immigration law, which is racist, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, is going to be repealed, okay, because it's self-evidently race-based. Another thing you have to mention here is the pragmatic reasons. Okay, there's perhaps moral reasons like it's racist, and we have to, eliminate that. Um, but also pragmatic reasons, meaning practical. What do I mean by this? It also means it's also connected, I should say, to Cold War, and I talked about the Cold War earlier. Okay, and here it says the influence of the civil rights movement, but also the Cold War. Let's remember that in the Cold War, we're trying to win, quote, the hearts and minds of third world nations newly decolonized. We want them to enter our first world rather than the second world in our fight against the USSR and China. Let's also recall that the third world is comprised of persons of color, darker skinned people who are ex colonial subjects of European empires, right? So, how would that look? In other words, how are we going to attract these persons, darker skinned people, into our orbit if we have racist structures and institutions in our own country, which is easily visible to them, these third world persons, right? How does that make us look, in other words? It makes us look hypocritical. In fact, the Soviet Union, in their propaganda, basically called us out. They were telling the third world persons, third world countries, their leaders and peoples, saying this: the first world, they call themselves the free world, but look at how they treat their persons of color. The United States has legal segregation, right? The people of color have no freedom in their country. So, do you believe them when they're trying to say they're on the side of freedom? That's propaganda emanating from the Kremlin, right? From the Soviet Union. So, how do we respond to that? Well, first of all, we can't deny it, right? So that's one reason why you see this fundamental change. It's not just moral part, like the civil rights movement, right? It's also world politics, foreign policy. We have to expunge, eradicate these race-based laws and institutions and so forth to try to attract right third world countries into our first world. So that's what happens. You see the dismantling of that, and certainly you see the dismantling of the '65 Immigration Act. It's in that spirit, right, of a pragmatic response, especially in the face of this condemnatory stance taken by the USSR, pointing at our policy and calling us hypocrites, right? Okay, but there's also an economic factor, I should say. I said in the slide here, pragmatic and moral. The moral, again, refers to civil rights. Pragmatic refers to core policy. But there's also economic reasons. And I um, referred to this earlier. Immediately after Second World War, we see unparalleled affluence and wealth in our country, very low unemployment, very high productivity in our industrial workforce. So again, it's the pinnacle of U.S. affluence. And therefore, this thriving economy perhaps erased the anxieties of any American who thought that, these immigrants would take jobs from Americans. All right. So let's recall earlier that, this was a big accusation, excuse me, cast towards Chinese, for example. Oh, you're taking jobs away from us. Certainly that happened with the Japanese too, the landowners. Okay, so all these things together, we could see how this serves as a historical backdrop to the repeal of the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. And it's going to be replaced by the 1965 Immigration Act. So what we're going to look at now is this preferential system, hierarchical preferential system. And we'll look at that at the next slide.